Sometimes the quietest choices echo the loudest. The wind howled against the thin walls of Emily Carter's small house, rattling the windows like it was trying to get in, and for a moment she just stood there in the dim yellow light, holding her breath, counting the seconds between each gust as if that could somehow calm the storm outside or the one building quietly inside her chest. The heater clicked, struggled, then went silent again, and she pulled her sweater tighter, her eyes drifting toward the kitchen counter where a nearly empty can of soup sat beside a crumpled bill she wasn't ready to open, $12 in her wallet, 3 days until payday, and no plan beyond getting through the night. And then it came, a sound so soft she almost thought she imagined it, a knock barely there, like someone didn't have the strength to try again, and Emily froze, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table, listening, the house suddenly too still, too quiet, until the knock came again, slightly louder this time, followed by a faint trembling voice that barely carried through the door. "Please." And something in that single word shifted the air in the room, not urgent, not demanding, just fragile, and Emily's eyes moved slowly toward the door as the wind pushed against it from the outside, the handle trembling slightly in its frame. And for a second she didn't move, her mind racing through everything she'd been taught about being careful, about strangers, about the world not always being kind. But then she stepped closer, one cautious step at a time, her breath visible in the cold air near the door. And when she finally turned the knob, the storm rushed in with a sharp gust, carrying with it the sight of an old woman standing on her porch, her coat thin, her hands shaking, her face pale under the faint porch light. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the wind filling the silence, until the woman looked up, her eyes tired but steady, and whispered, "I'm sorry to bother you. I just needed somewhere warm." And Emily felt something tighten in her chest, not fear, not hesitation, something quieter, something heavier. And she glanced once over her shoulder at the small, struggling warmth of her home, at the life she could barely hold together, and then back at the woman who had nothing at all. And without another word, she stepped aside and opened the door just a little wider. The old woman did not step in right away, as if she needed a second to believe the warmth was real, her eyes scanning the small room, the worn couch, the flickering light, the quiet struggle of a place that was barely holding together. And Emily noticed it, that pause, that hesitation, and for a brief moment she wondered if the woman could see everything, not just the room but the life behind it, the unpaid bills, the empty fridge, the exhaustion she carried in her shoulders. But then the woman took a slow step forward, and the door closed behind her with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have been, sealing the cold outside and trapping the quiet inside. And Emily moved quickly, almost automatically, grabbing the only clean blanket she had, draping it gently over the woman's shoulders, her hands steady even as her thoughts raced, and she guided her toward the small chair by the heater, the one spot in the house that still held a little warmth. And for a few seconds, neither of them spoke, only the soft hum of the struggling heater and the distant sound of wind pressing against the walls, until Emily turned toward the kitchen, her eyes landing on the single can of soup, and she hesitated, just for a breath, her fingers brushing the edge of the counter, calculating without meaning to what she would eat tomorrow, how she would stretch what little she had left. But then she reached for the can anyway, opening it with a quiet click, pouring it into a pot as the faint smell filled the air, something simple, something warm, something enough. And when she handed the bowl to the woman, their fingers almost touched, and the woman looked up at her with an expression that was not just gratitude, but something deeper, something searching. "You did not have to do this," she said softly, her voice steadier now, and Emily shrugged slightly, leaning back against the counter, her arms crossing loosely as if to hold herself together. "I know," she replied, her tone calm, almost distant, "but you needed it." And the woman watched her for a moment longer, her eyes narrowing just slightly as if she was measuring something invisible, something beyond words. "And what about you?" she asked quietly. "What do you need?" And the question lingered in the air, heavier than expected, and Emily let out a small breath, her gaze dropping to the floor before lifting again, steady, composed. "I will figure it out," she said, and there was no bitterness in her voice, no complaint, just a quiet certainty that made the room feel different somehow. And the woman nodded slowly, taking another spoonful of soup, her hands no longer shaking, and for a while they sat in silence, the kind that did not feel empty but full. And when the bowl was empty, the woman placed it carefully on the table, reaching into her coat pocket with slow, deliberate movement, and Emily watched without thinking, her eyes catching the faint glint of something, a folded handkerchief, worn but clean, embroidered with small, careful initials, and the woman held it for a second before placing it gently on the table between them, her gaze meeting Emily's, calm, knowing, almost as if she had already decided something that Emily did not yet understand. The woman did not explain the handkerchief, she only left it there between them, as if it belonged in that moment more than words ever could, and Emily looked at it without reaching for it, her eyes tracing the delicate stitching, the letters M and H woven carefully into the corner, neat, precise, intentional, and something about it felt out of place in a house where everything else was worn, mismatched, temporary, and she finally picked it up, turning it slightly between her fingers, the fabric softer than she expected, like it had been kept safe for a long time, and when she looked up, the woman was already watching her, not with curiosity, but with a quiet certainty that made Emily shift slightly where she stood. "It is beautiful," Emily said softly, placing it back on the table, unsure why it felt like more than just a piece of cloth, and the woman smiled, faint but knowing. "It has been carried through many winters," she replied, her voice steady now, almost warm, and Emily nodded, not fully understanding but not needing to, because something in the room had already changed, something subtle, something that did not ask to be named, and the hours passed quietly after that, the storm outside slowly losing its strength while the silence inside settled into something almost peaceful, the kind of silence that does not feel empty but full, and at some point Emily stood, gesturing gently toward the small bedroom. "You can take the bed," she said, her tone simple, leaving no space for argument, and the woman hesitated just for a second before nodding, rising slowly, her movements careful but no longer fragile, and as she walked past Emily, she paused, her hand resting lightly against the doorframe. "Not everyone opens the door," she said quietly, not as a compliment but as a fact, and Emily gave a small, almost amused breath. "Most people are just careful," she replied, and the woman looked at her for a moment longer, her eyes thoughtful. "And some people choose not to be," she said before stepping into the room, closing the door softly behind her, and Emily remained where she was, standing in the dim light, listening to the quiet, the wind now distant, the house still, and she glanced at the handkerchief again, the initials catching the light, and for reasons she could not explain, she folded it carefully and placed it on the table as if it mattered, as if it should not be forgotten, and when she finally lay down on the couch, pulling the thin blanket over herself, sleep did not come right away, her mind replaying the night in fragments, the knock, the voice, the eyes of a stranger who felt less like a stranger than she should have, and sometime before dawn, when the sky was still gray and the world had not yet decided to wake, Emily drifted into a light, restless sleep, unaware that when she opened her eyes again, the house would be quiet in a very different way, and the door to the bedroom would stand slightly open, with no one inside. Emily woke slowly, the kind of waking that comes without reason, her eyes opening to a silence that felt too complete, too still, and for a moment she lay there on the couch, staring at the ceiling, listening for something she could not name, until it registered the absence, no soft movement from the bedroom, no quiet breathing, no subtle presence of another person in the house, and she sat up, the blanket slipping from her shoulders as the cold air returned to claim the room, sharper now that the heater had gone silent again, and her gaze moved instinctively toward the hallway, toward the door that had been closed just hours before, now slightly open, just enough to reveal darkness beyond it, and Emily stood, her steps slow, careful, not out of fear but out of something quieter, something uncertain, and when she reached the door, she pushed it gently, the hinge creaking softly as the room inside came into view, the bed untouched in the way that only happens when someone leaves before the world wakes, the blanket folded back neatly, too neatly, as if whoever had been there had taken care not to leave a trace, and Emily frowned slightly, stepping closer, her eyes scanning the small space, the window closed, the lock still in place, no sign of how the woman had left, no sound of a door opening in the night, no memory of footsteps, just absence, clean and complete, and she exhaled slowly, a breath she had not realized she was holding, and turned back toward the main room, her mind already trying to make sense of it. Maybe the woman had felt better and left early, maybe she did not want to be a burden, maybe this was just what people did when they did not belong somewhere, they disappeared before morning, but something about it did not settle, something about the quiet precision of it, the way nothing was disturbed, felt deliberate, and Emily's eyes drifted to the table, and there it was, exactly where it had been placed the night before, the handkerchief, folded carefully, waiting, and she walked toward it slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of the table before she picked it up again, holding it a little longer this time, noticing the stitching more closely, the letters M and H not just neat but intentional, the kind of detail that comes from time, from care, from a life that did not match the fragile figure she had opened the door to, and she turned it slightly in the light, her brow tightening just a little as a thought flickered across her mind, something she could not quite catch, and then it was gone, leaving only the quiet room and the soft fabric in her hand, and Emily let out a small breath, folding it again the way she had found it, placing it back down with the same care, as if returning something important, even if she did not yet know why. And outside the storm had passed, the sky pale and clear, the world moving on as if nothing had happened, as if the night had not left anything behind, but inside, the silence felt different now, not empty, not cold, but waiting, as if something unseen had shifted just enough to change what would come next. And Emily stood there for a moment longer, unaware that somewhere across the city someone else was already searching, already asking questions, already following a trail that led directly to her door. By late morning, the house had returned to its usual rhythm, quiet, modest, untouched by anything extraordinary, and yet Emily moved through it differently, as if something unseen had followed her from the night before, lingering in the corners, in the silence between her steps, and she tried to ignore it, pulling on her coat, checking her phone, glancing at the time, already late for her shift, already behind on a day that had not even fully begun, and as she reached for the door, her eyes drifted once more to the table, to the handkerchief resting exactly where she had left it, and for a second she hesitated, her fingers hovering in the air, before she picked it up and slipped it into her pocket without fully knowing why, only that leaving it behind felt wrong, like forgetting something important that had not yet revealed its meaning. And outside the air was crisp, the storm reduced to thin patches of snow along the sidewalk, the world moving forward as if the night had been nothing more than weather. And Emily walked quickly, her breath steady, her mind already shifting back to practical things, hours, tips, bills, the quiet math of survival that left little room for mystery. And by the time she reached the diner, the familiar sounds wrapped around her, plates clinking, voices overlapping, the steady rhythm of a place that did not pause for anyone, and she stepped into it without hesitation, tying her apron, offering a quick apology to her manager, slipping into motion as if nothing had changed, and for a while nothing did. Orders came and went, coffee refilled, small conversations exchanged, the routine carrying her forward the way it always had, grounding her in something predictable, something safe, until the bell above the door chimed, a small, ordinary sound that somehow cut through everything else, and Emily glanced up without thinking, her eyes landing briefly on the entrance. Just another customer, she assumed, until she noticed the stillness that followed, the way the room shifted ever so slightly, conversations lowering, attention turning, not dramatically, not enough to cause alarm, but enough to feel, and she straightened just a little, her gaze returning to the door, and this time she saw him clearly, a man standing just inside, his coat dark, tailored, his posture controlled, deliberate, the kind of presence that did not ask for attention but held it anyway. And for a second, their eyes met across the room, and something passed between them that Emily could not explain, not recognition, not familiarity, just a pause, like a question that had not yet been asked, and the man stepped forward, scanning the space with quiet focus. His movements calm but purposeful, as if he was not here by chance, as if he had come looking for something specific, and Emily felt a subtle tension settle in her chest, not fear, not quite, but awareness, the kind that makes you stand a little straighter without knowing why. And as she approached his table, her voice steady, professional, the way it always was, "Good morning, what can I get for you?" The man did not answer right away, his eyes studying her, not rudely, not harshly, but carefully, as if confirming something he had only just begun to believe. And then quietly, almost gently, he spoke, "Emily Carter." And the sound of her name, spoken by a stranger, landed heavier than it should have, and for the first time that morning, the ordinary day she had tried to hold on to began to slip just slightly out of place. Emily did not answer right away, the sound of her own name lingering in the air as if it had weight, as if it carried something more than just recognition, and she held onto her notepad a little tighter, her fingers pressing into the paper as she studied the man in front of her, his expression calm, composed, but not casual, not the way most customers looked at her, and for a brief second she considered brushing it off, pretending she had misheard. But something in his gaze made that impossible. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady though quieter than before. "That is me." And the man nodded once, as if confirming a detail he had already known, his eyes not leaving hers. "My name is Richard Hayes," he said, his tone measured, controlled, and the name did not mean anything to her, not yet, just another stranger, another introduction, but the way he said it, the way the room seemed to hold its breath for a second longer than usual, made it feel like it should, and Emily felt that same subtle shift again, the one she had noticed when he walked in, the sense that something was unfolding just beyond her understanding, and she glanced briefly around the diner, noticing how a few people had gone quiet, how her manager stood still near the counter, watching without pretending not to, and when she looked back at Richard, he had already leaned slightly forward, his voice lower now, not for secrecy but for focus. "I believe you helped someone last night," he said, and Emily's breath caught, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough for her to feel it, that moment when something inside aligns with something outside. And she straightened just a little, her mind moving quickly, the door, the storm, the woman, the handkerchief in her pocket, and she nodded slowly. "An older woman," she said, choosing her words carefully. She needed somewhere warm. And Richard's eyes softened, just slightly, not enough for most people to notice, but enough for the tension in his posture to shift, and he exhaled, a quiet breath that carried something close to relief. "She is my mother," he said, and the words settled between them, simple, direct, but heavier than anything that had been said so far, and Emily blinked once, processing, her mind trying to connect the fragile figure from the night before with the composed man standing in front of her, and for a moment the two images did not fit, not easily, not without effort, and she felt her fingers brush unconsciously against the pocket of her apron, the faint outline of the folded fabric still there, grounding her in something real, and Richard continued, his voice steady but no longer distant. "She left our home 3 nights ago," he said. "No explanation, no phone, nothing. We have been looking for her since." And Emily listened, her expression unchanged, but her thoughts shifting, adjusting, seeing the night again through a different lens, not just a stranger at her door, but someone who had been missing, someone who had chosen to leave, and something about that word, chosen, stayed with her, and she met his gaze again, her voice quiet but clear. "She did not seem lost," she said, and Richard's brow moved slightly, just enough to show that the answer mattered, just enough to show that it was not what he expected, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was waiting, as if both of them had reached the edge of something neither of them fully understood yet, and somewhere in that quiet space, the simple act of opening a door the night before began to feel like the beginning of something much larger than either of them had planned. Richard did not respond immediately, her words settling into him in a way that was visible only in the smallest shift of his expression, a slight tightening at the corner of his eyes, a pause that felt deliberate rather than uncertain, and Emily watched him closely now, no longer just a waitress taking an order, but someone standing in the middle of a conversation that had quietly changed direction. And after a moment he nodded once, almost to himself. "That sounds like her," he said, his voice softer than before, as if he had stepped out of whatever role he carried into the diner and into something more personal, more real, and Emily tilted her head slightly, studying him. She was not confused, she added, her tone calm but firm. She knew exactly where she was. And Richard let out a slow breath, his gaze lowering briefly to the table before returning to her, and this time there was something different in it. Not authority, not control, but recognition, as if he was beginning to see something he had missed before, and around them the diner had returned to its quiet rhythm, but the space between them remained still, untouched by the noise, and Emily shifted her weight slightly, her fingers brushing again against the folded handkerchief in her pocket, and without fully deciding to, she reached for it, pulling it out and placing it gently on the table between them, and the moment it touched the surface, something changed. Richard's eyes dropped to it instantly, his entire posture stilling, and for a second he did not move, did not speak, as if the small piece of fabric carried more weight than anything else in the room, and then slowly, he reached forward, his fingers stopping just above it before finally touching it, careful, almost reverent, and Emily saw it then, not in words, not in expression, but in the quiet way his shoulders lowered, the way his breath shifted. "She always carries this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper now. "She has had it for years." And he lifted it slightly, turning it in his hand, his thumb brushing over the embroidered initials as if confirming something he already knew, and Emily watched him, her own understanding shifting again, the night unfolding in a new light, the woman, the questions, the calm, the way she had looked at everything as if she was not lost but searching, and Richard looked up again, his gaze steady on Emily. Did she say anything else? He asked, not demanding, not pressing but needing, and Emily hesitated for a moment, replaying the conversation in her mind, the quiet words, the pauses, the feeling behind them, and then she spoke, her voice low but clear. She asked me if I would still be kind, if someone powerful had hurt me. And the sentence hung in the air between them, heavier than before, and Richard's reaction was subtle but unmistakable, a flicker of something crossing his face, something that disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared, but not before Emily noticed, and for the first time, the story in front of her felt incomplete in a different way, not just about a missing woman, but about something deeper, something unspoken, and she met his gaze again, her expression calm but searching now. She was not just looking for warmth, Emily said quietly. She was looking for something else, and Richard held her gaze silent, as if he already knew that was true, but was only just beginning to understand what it meant. Richard did not look away from her, but something in his silence shifted, no longer searching, no longer uncertain, but settling into a realization he had been resisting, and his grip on the handkerchief tightened just slightly, the fabric folding under his fingers as if it carried more than memory, and Emily noticed it. That subtle change, the way his composure held but no longer shielded him the same way, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the noise of the diner fading into the background as if the world had quietly stepped aside to let something else unfold, and then Richard exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just enough to show the weight he had been carrying. She used to do this, he said, his voice calm but distant now, as if speaking from somewhere far behind the present moment. Disappear. Without telling anyone, not for long, just enough to observe, and Emily tilted her head slightly, her eyes steady on him. Observe what? She asked, and Richard gave a faint, almost humorless breath, his gaze drifting briefly to the window before returning to her. People, he said. She believed that you could learn everything about a person in one unguarded moment. And the words lingered between them, quiet but heavy, and Emily felt something settle into place, not fully, not completely, but enough to change how she saw the night, the questions, the calm presence of a woman who had not seemed afraid even when she had every reason to be, and she crossed her arms loosely, her posture relaxed but attentive. So she left, just to see who would open the door, she said, not accusing, not judging, just stating what now felt obvious, and Richard met her gaze, his expression unreadable for a second before he nodded once, slowly. Yes, he said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any explanation could have, and Emily let out a quiet breath, her eyes dropping briefly to the table, to the handkerchief now resting between them again, and she thought about the moment she had opened the door, the hesitation, the choice, the absence of anything extraordinary except the decision itself, and when she looked back up, her expression had shifted, not surprised, not impressed, just clear. Then she found what she was looking for, Emily said, her voice steady, and Richard's gaze held hers, something flickering there, something that looked like agreement but felt deeper, more personal, and he nodded again, this time without hesitation. She did, he replied quietly, and for a moment the air between them softened, the tension easing into something quieter, something closer to understanding, and yet, beneath that calm, there was still something unresolved, something that had not yet surfaced, and Emily felt it, that subtle undercurrent, the sense that this was not just about a test or a search, and she shifted slightly, her voice lowering just enough to carry the weight of the question forming in her mind. But that is not why you are here, she said, and Richard's expression changed, not dramatically, not suddenly, but enough for her to see it, the way his eyes sharpened, the way his posture straightened just slightly, as if he had been waiting for that moment, waiting for her to see past the surface, and the silence that followed was no longer soft, it was precise, intentional, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but the meaning behind it landed with quiet force. No, he said, it is not. And in that single word, Emily understood that whatever had begun with a knock at her door had not ended there, not even close. Emily held his gaze steady and quiet, as if she had already stepped into whatever this moment was becoming, and the noise of the diner faded even further, the clink of plates, the low hum of conversation, all distant now, like something happening behind glass, and Richard leaned back slightly, not retreating, but creating just enough space to speak clearly, deliberately. My mother does not just observe, he said. His voice calm, measured. She decides. And the word lingered, heavier than the others, and Emily's brow shifted just slightly, not confusion, not concern, just attention sharpening, and she did not interrupt, did not rush him, allowing the silence to hold until he continued. For the past 10 years she has been involved in every major decision I have made, he said, his tone even, but something beneath it carried weight. History. Not because she needed to be, but because I trusted her judgment more than my own. And Emily's eyes moved briefly to the handkerchief, then back to him, the pieces beginning to arrange themselves in a pattern she could not yet fully see, and Richard exhaled slowly, his fingers resting lightly against the table now, no longer gripping the fabric but not letting it go either. 3 nights ago we had a disagreement, he said, and this time there was a subtle shift, something quieter, something closer to honesty than control. She told me I had started to see people as outcomes, not as people. And the sentence settled between them, simple, direct, but carrying something deeper than it appeared, and Emily felt it, not as judgment but as recognition, the kind that does not need explanation, and Richard's gaze dropped for a moment before lifting again, meeting hers with a clarity that had not been there before. She left after that, he said. No explanation, no argument, just gone. And Emily remained still, her posture unchanged, but her understanding shifting again, not just a test, not just observation, but something intentional, something directed, and she spoke quietly, her voice even. She did not leave to disappear, she said, and Richard's eyes focused on her instantly. She left to prove something. And the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was precise, like a line drawn between what was said and what was understood. And Richard nodded once, slowly, as if confirming what he had already begun to suspect. And Emily let out a small breath, her gaze steady. And now you are here, she added, not as a question but as a continuation, and Richard leaned forward again, his voice lower now, more direct. Because you are the only person she chose to stop for, he said, and the words landed with quiet force, not dramatic, not overwhelming but undeniable, and Emily did not react the way most people would have. There was no surprise, no visible shift, only a slight narrowing of her eyes as she considered what that meant, not for him, not for the story, but for the choice she had made without thinking, and Richard watched her closely, as if expecting something, a reaction, a question, but Emily only tilted her head slightly, her voice calm, grounded. I did not do anything special, she said, and Richard's expression changed, just slightly, not disagreement but understanding. That is exactly why she stopped, he replied, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The space between them filled with something quiet but undeniable, the weight of a simple act now carrying meaning neither of them had fully anticipated. And somewhere in that stillness, Emily realized that whatever came next would not be about what she had done, but about what it revealed. Emily did not look impressed, she did not look overwhelmed, she simply stood there, absorbing the weight of his words without letting them change her posture, her expression, or the quiet steadiness in her eyes, and for a moment Richard studied her more carefully than before, as if this lack of reaction, was the very thing he had been sent to find, and the silence between them stretched just long enough to become meaningful before Emily spoke, her voice calm, almost gentle. Then she did not need me, she said, and Richard's brow shifted slightly, not confusion but interest, and she continued. She needed to see if someone would open the door without knowing who she was, and the words landed simply, but they carried a clarity that cut through everything else, and Richard let out a slow breath, his gaze lowering briefly to the table, to the handkerchief still resting between them, before returning to her, and this time there was no distance left in his expression, only something honest, something unguarded. You are right, he said quietly, and for the first time since he had walked in, his voice carried something close to humility, not forced, not performed, just present, and Emily nodded once, not as agreement but as acknowledgement, and she reached for her notepad again, her movements returning to something familiar, something grounded. Would you like some coffee? She asked, her tone shifting back to simple professionalism, and the question caught him slightly off guard, not because of what she said, but because of what she did not say. No curiosity about his wealth, no interest in what this might mean for her, no attempt to turn the moment into something else, and Richard watched her for a second longer before giving a small nod. Yes, he said, and as she turned to pour it, he remained seated, his eyes following her, noticing the details he might have ignored before, the quiet efficiency in her movements, the way she carried herself without drawing attention, the absence of anything that asked for recognition, and when she returned, placing the cup gently in front of him. Their fingers did not touch, but the moment felt connected anyway, and Emily stepped back slightly, giving him space, and Richard wrapped his hands around the cup, not drinking yet, just holding it, as if grounding himself in something simple, something real, and after a moment he spoke again, his voice quieter now, more deliberate. "She left me something as well," he said. And Emily's gaze shifted back to him, attentive but calm, and he reached into his coat, pulling out a small folded note, placing it beside the handkerchief, his movements careful, almost precise, and Emily looked at it without reaching for it, waiting, and Richard exhaled slowly before continuing. "It only had one sentence," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "Find the person who does not ask for anything in return." And the words settled into the space between them, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, and Emily felt the meaning of them without needing to respond, without needing to question, and for a moment neither of them moved, the diner continuing around them, unaware that something quiet and significant had just taken shape at a small table by the window, and in that stillness, the simple act of opening a door the night before had become something else entirely, not an accident, not a coincidence, but a moment that had been seen, chosen, and now returned. Emily did not reach for the note, not immediately, her eyes resting on it as if it carried weight that did not need to be touched to be understood, and the words lingered in her mind, simple, clear, almost quiet in the way they settled, and for a moment she said nothing, only stood there with that same steady presence that had not changed since he arrived. And Richard watched her, not impatient, not expecting, just observing, the way his mother would have. And after a few seconds Emily finally moved, not toward the note, but toward the coffee pot behind her, refilling another cup without being asked, her movements smooth, grounded, as if she was choosing to stay within something familiar before stepping into what was not. And when she returned, placing the fresh cup down beside him, she spoke, her voice calm, almost thoughtful. "Then she already knew what she would find," she said, and Richard looked at her, the slightest shift in his expression revealing that he had considered that possibility but had not fully accepted it until now, and he nodded slowly. "She usually does," he replied, and Emily gave a small, almost imperceptible breath, her gaze lowering briefly to the note before lifting again. And this time there was something different in her eyes, not hesitation, not curiosity, but clarity. "And what are you supposed to do when you find that person?" she asked, and the question was not directed at him as a man, but at the meaning behind the moment, and Richard paused, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, the handkerchief and the note between them like two quiet answers waiting to be understood, and he did not respond right away, because the truth of it did not come easily, not in the way most things in his life had, and when he finally spoke, his voice was softer, more deliberate than before. "I do not think this is about what I am supposed to do," he said, and Emily's gaze remained steady on him, listening, and he continued, "I think this is about what I have been doing wrong." And the honesty in his words did not feel like confession, it felt like realization, the kind that comes quietly but changes everything, and Emily held that for a moment, not reacting, not affirming, just allowing it to exist without interruption. And then she reached forward, finally picking up the note, unfolding it slowly, her eyes scanning the single line written there, and she did not smile, she did not react, she simply read it once, then folded it again with the same care, placing it back down exactly where it had been. And when she looked up at him again, her expression had not changed, but something in her presence had, something deeper, more certain. "Then maybe she was not asking you to find someone," Emily said quietly, and Richard's eyes narrowed just slightly, focused now, and she continued, her voice steady. "Maybe she was asking you to recognize what you stopped seeing." And the words settled between them, not heavy, not sharp, but undeniable, and Richard did not look away this time, because something in that sentence had reached past everything else, past the wealth, the decisions, the control, and landed somewhere quieter, somewhere he had not visited in a long time, and for a moment the room felt still again, not empty, but full of something that did not need to be named, and in that stillness Emily stepped back slightly, returning to her place in the room, not as someone who had been chosen, but as someone who had simply remained unchanged, and Richard sat there, the note and the handkerchief in front of him, realizing that for the first time in a long time the answer he had been searching for was not something he could take, but something he had to understand. Richard did not speak for a long moment, not because he did not have words, but because for the first time words felt insufficient, and he sat there quietly, his gaze fixed somewhere between the note and the handkerchief, as if both of them now carried a meaning that had only just revealed itself, and around him the diner continued as it always had, waitresses moving, customers talking, plates clinking, but none of it seemed to reach him anymore. And Emily noticed it, the stillness in him, not The kind that comes from control, but the kind that comes when control is no longer the answer. And she did not interrupt, did not fill the silence, she simply allowed it to exist, the way she had allowed everything else that morning. And after a while, Richard reached for the note again, unfolding it slowly, his eyes tracing the same line as before, but this time reading it differently, not as an instruction, not as a task, but as something far more personal, and his hand lowered slightly, the paper resting against the table as he let out a quiet breath. I built everything around outcomes, he said, his voice calm but no longer distant. Every decision, every relationship, every risk, it was always about what it would lead to. And Emily listened without moving, her posture relaxed, her expression unchanged, and he continued, I thought that was what made things work, what made things successful. And there was no pride in his tone now, only clarity, the kind that comes when something you believed for a long time no longer holds the same truth. And Emily tilted her head slightly, her voice soft but steady. And now, she said, and the question was simple, but it carried everything forward, and Richard looked up at her, his gaze clear in a way it had not been before. Now I see what it cost, he replied, and the words did not need explanation, they settled into the space between them naturally, and Emily gave a small nod, not as agreement but as acknowledgement, and she stepped back slightly, giving him space again, not physically but in the moment itself, allowing him to sit with what he had just said. And after a few seconds, Richard reached into his coat once more, pulling out something else this time, a small envelope, plain, unmarked, and he placed it beside the note, his movements careful, deliberate, and Emily's eyes flicked to it briefly, then back to him, and he met her gaze, his voice steady but no longer carrying any assumption. This is not payment, he said, and the way he said it made that clear before the words even finished. And it is not a reward, he added. It is an opportunity. And Emily did not reach for it, did not ask what it contained, she simply stood there, her expression unchanged, and Richard continued, My company funds programs for people who have been overlooked, people who were never given a chance to do more than survive, he said, education, training, positions that do not come easily, and he paused not to build tension, but because the next part mattered more than the rest. If you ever decide that you want something different, he said quietly, this will open that door. And the word door lingered, not by accident, and Emily noticed it, the way it connected back to the night before, the way everything now seemed to circle that single moment, and she looked at the envelope again, then back at him, her voice calm, grounded. And if I do not? She asked, and Richard did not hesitate this time. Then nothing changes, he said, and there was no disappointment in his tone, no expectation, only acceptance, and for a moment, they stood there, the envelope, the note, and the handkerchief between them, three quiet symbols of something larger than any of them alone, and Emily reached forward, not for the envelope, but for the handkerchief, lifting it gently, her fingers smoothing the fabric as if returning it to where it belonged, and she held it out toward him, her eyes steady. She did not leave it for me, she said softly, and Richard looked at her, understanding passing between them without needing to be spoken. And as he took it from her hand, something in the moment settled, not with finality, but with clarity, as if the purpose of it had been fulfilled, and neither of them needed to say anything more to know that whatever had begun with a simple knock had already changed both of them in ways that could not be undone. Richard stood slowly, the movement unhurried, not because he lacked purpose, but because for the first time in a long time, he was no longer rushing toward one, and the chair behind him slid back with a soft sound that barely registered against the quiet weight of the moment. And Emily remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her eyes steady, as if nothing needed to be added, nothing needed to be taken away. And for a brief second they simply looked at each other, not as a billionaire and a waitress, not as two people from different worlds, but as two individuals who had just seen something true at the same time. And Richard gave a small nod, not formal, not distant but genuine, the kind that did not require acknowledgement, and Emily returned it just as simply. And then he reached for the envelope, lifting it from the table and placing it gently closer to her side, not pushing it, not insisting, just leaving it within reach, and she did not move to take it, not yet, her gaze resting on it only for a moment before returning to him, and he understood, without needing explanation, that whatever choice would be made did not belong to this moment, and he turned slightly, adjusting his coat, the handkerchief now resting in his pocket where it had always belonged. And as he took a step away from the table, he paused, not because he had forgotten something, but because something remained unsaid, and he glanced back at her, his voice quiet but clear. She will come back, he said, and Emily tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. I know, she replied, and there was no doubt in her voice, no question, just a calm certainty that seemed to settle the space between them once more, and Richard studied her for a second longer, as if committing the moment to memory, not as a transaction, not as an outcome, but as something that existed on its own, and then he nodded again, more subtly this time, before turning and walking toward the door, his presence no longer shifting the room the way it had when he entered, not because it had diminished, but because something else had taken its place, something quieter, something less visible, and the bell above the door chimed softly as he stepped outside, the cold air meeting him without resistance, and inside, the diner returned to its rhythm, the small steady movements of a world that continued regardless of who passed through it, and Emily stood there for a moment longer, the envelope still resting on the table, the note beside it, and she reached forward slowly, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with intention, her fingers brushing the edge of the envelope as she lifted it slightly, feeling its weight, not in dollars or opportunity but in possibility, and she looked at it for a second, then placed it back down exactly where it had been, not rejecting it, not accepting it, simply allowing it to remain, the way some choices are not made all at once but over time, and she picked up the note instead, folding it carefully, placing it into her apron pocket, not as something to keep but as something to remember, and then she turned, picking up a tray, stepping back into motion as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had, and outside, somewhere beyond the quiet street and the passing cars, a woman who had walked into the night without fear was already on her way back, not to test again, but to see what had grown from a door that had been opened without question, and in the stillness that followed, one truth remained, quiet, simple, and impossible to ignore, that kindness given without reason does not disappear, it returns, not always in the way you expect, but always in the way you need.